A galactic commander laughed at humanity's weapons. 10 minutes later, he was negotiating for peace. A rail accelerator, a calm major with a notepad, and 195 paranoid nation-states. That combination changed everything. Commander Thalin Vorsk wasn't born cruel. He was efficient, methodical. For 32 standard cycles, he had served the Vorthan Imperial Consolidation, overseeing 14 planetary absorptions and personally certifying the military disarmament of 51 species who had been politely invited to join the Vorthan fold. Some resisted. None succeeded. By his own tally, and depending on which historian you consulted, his record was either brilliantly diplomatic or quietly terrifying. He preferred decisive. The Vorthan didn't conquer through brute force. That was the subtle truth outsiders always missed. They conquered through demonstration. Show a lesser civilization the canyon between their firepower and yours. Then watch the arithmetic do your work for you. No blood, no planetary bombardment, just the quiet, inevitable logic of self-preservation. For 32 years, that logic had never failed. Thalin was not a creature of impulse. His species, the Vorthan, had evolved on a high-gravity world where patience was a survival mechanism. Their bodies were dense, their movements deliberate, their minds wired for long-term strategic calculation. When other species panicked, the Vorthan waited. When others struck first in fear, the Vorthan gathered data. This approach had elevated them from a minor regional power to the dominant force in 3 spiral arms. Thalin embodied this philosophy perfectly. He was tall even by Vorthan standards, his carapace a deep charcoal gray, streaked with the ceremonial silver markings of a fleet commander. His primary optical sensors were calibrated to detect micro-expressions. His secondary manipulators, designed never tremble. He had seen species weep, rage, bargain, and betray. He had watched governments crumble under the weight of their own fear. And he had signed the integration documents every single time. So when Earth first transmitted its refusal to sign the Vorthan Hegemony Accords, Thalin didn't rage. He didn't order an orbital strike. He simply followed protocol, scheduled a joint military exhibition, boarded his flagship the Irrefutable Logic, and traveled with his full delegation to the small, blue, utterly forgettable planet circling a thoroughly average star. The journey took 9 standard days. Thalin used every hour of it to study humanity. He read their history first. That was always the wisest approach. A species' past revealed their deepest programming, the unconscious patterns that would dictate the response to pressure. The human past was, by Vorthan standards, astonishingly violent. They had fought wars over resources, ideology, skin color, and the precise location of imaginary lines drawn on maps. They had developed weapons capable of ending their own civilization before they had even achieved reliable spaceflight. They had come within seconds of nuclear annihilation on multiple occasions, always pulling back at the last possible moment through a combination of luck and last-minute sanity. Thalin found this both concerning and reassuring. The violence was concerning. The pattern of self-correction was reassuring. He categorized humans as a high-conflict, high-adaptation species, dangerous in small doses, ultimately manageable through proper incentives. Then he read their biological file. Humans were bipedal, mostly hairless above the neck, disturbingly lacking in redundant organ systems. 1 heart, 1 liver, 2 lungs, which barely qualified as redundancy, since losing either would still kill them outright. No carapace. No venom sacs. No natural weaponry of any kind. Their skin was so thin that Thalin could practically see the blood moving through it from standard observation distance. They required constant temperature regulation, constant hydration, constant caloric intake. They slept for 1/3 of their existence. They died from infections that Vorthan infants shrugged off. He had reviewed their biological profile on the approach shuttle. He had not been concerned. The delegation arrived in high Earth orbit on a morning that Fallon would later replay in his memory thousands of times, searching for clues he had missed. The orbital docking port was functional, but unremarkable. The human welcoming committee was small. A few diplomatic officials, a security detail, and one military officer who stepped forward before anyone else could speak. Her name was Major Siravos. She arrived in a plain dark jacket, carrying one assistant, 2 hardened data slates, and an expression that suggested she had already finished the most interesting part of this conversation before it began. She was not tall by human standards. Her posture was relaxed. Her hands were empty. She walked toward Fallon with the unhurried confidence of someone who had already calculated every possible outcome and found all of them acceptable. She clasped Fallon's primary manipulator with her 5-fingered hand, looked directly into his main optical sensor, and said, "Appreciate you making the trip, Commander. Welcome to high Earth orbit." Fallon studied her for a long moment. Her pulse was visible at her throat, a rapid rhythm that suggested elevated metabolic activity, but her face betrayed nothing. Her eyes did not widen. Her breathing did not change. She stood before a Vorthan fleet commander with the same expression she might have worn while ordering coffee. "Major Voss," he said, his translator node pulsing, "we will proceed to the exhibition range. Your government has received the standard summary of Vorthan military capability. Today, you will provide a comparable display of your own armaments. Then we will compare. Then we will discuss terms of integration." "Sure," said Major Voss. She said it the way someone says, "sure," when they have already decided the outcome and are simply waiting for you to catch up. Fallon noticed this. He filed it away in a neural subprocess dedicated to anomaly detection. And then, because he had 32 years of successful precedent, he ignored it. The exhibition floor was a flat stretch of lunar regolith, prepared in advance by Vorthan engineering teams. Rows of military-grade alloy barriers had been placed at calibrated distances. Atmospheric containment shields hummed overhead. The entire event was being broadcast to the Imperial Review Council, which meant Fallon needed this to run cleanly, and with signatures, and generate no inconvenient questions. He gestured to his weapons master, Commander Yevon, who delivered the Vorthan demonstration first. Vorthan plasma destabilizers were, by any objective standard, devastating. The first volley turned a line of alloy barriers to metallic mist in 3.8 seconds. The second volley collapsed a simulated bunker complex with a single sustained burst. Yevon then activated the long-range tracking array, which acquired, locked, and fired at a target over 7,000 units distant, striking dead center in a pulse that took 9 milliseconds. The entire exhibition lasted roughly 11 minutes. When it finished, Fallon looked at Major Voss. She was taking notes, by hand, on paper, with a small graphite stick. "Impressive," she said, in a tone that suggested she was writing the word impressive next to a number she would later compare to other numbers. Fallon waited. Then he swept a claw toward the cleared area. "Your demonstration, Niger." What followed were the most bewildering 14 minutes of Fallon's professional life. A team of humans in protective gear rolled out a collection of long metal cylinders on wheeled mounts. Some were so massive they required 4 operators to position. Others were small enough that a single soldier carried one across their shoulder. There were devices that seemed to rely on chemical propellants. There were devices that appeared to launch solid kinetic penetrators. One soldier produced something handheld that fit in a single palm. Fallon leaned toward Yevon. "Is this their complete arsenal?" Yevon consulted his sensor pad. Per their pre-submission filing, yes. Chemical combustion? To propel small metal fragments? Yes. Against alloy combat barriers? Yes. Fallon turned back to the demonstration. He watched a human soldier fire one of the large tubes at a standard Vorthan-grade alloy slab. There was a sharp report, a small explosion, and then a dent. A shallow dent in the outer layer of a target that Vorthan plasma destabilizers had vaporized in under 4 seconds. Thalin laughed. He didn't mean to. 32 years of diplomatic composure, and the sound just escaped. It started as a low rumble in his primary lung chamber, then burst through his translator node before he could suppress it. And then Yevon laughed. And then the entire Vorthan delegation laughed. The laughter rolled across the lunar surface, the way all embarrassing things roll, loudly, clearly, and in a direction that could never be taken back. Major Voss did not laugh. She wrote something on her paper, underlined it. Thalin could see the motion of her stylus, though he could not read the human script. The gesture was small, almost dismissive, but something about it made his secondary lung tighten. He told himself it was just the thin atmosphere. He told himself he was imagining things. The laughter faded. Thalin composed himself, smoothed the ceremonial sash across his thorax, and said with what he considered remarkable restraint, "Major, we have assessed your arsenal. We appreciate your transparency. However, I believe you will acknowledge that the gap in capability is substantial. We recommend your government reconsider the hegemony accords. We are prepared to offer generous terms. Cultural sovereignty will be preserved. Economic integration will be phased. You will not be asked to." "We're not finished," said Major Voss. Thalin paused. "Pardon?" "The demonstration isn't complete." She tucked her notepad under one arm. "What you've seen so far are what we call conventional systems. Standard infantry equipment. Reliable, accurate, cost-effective in volume. We use those for smaller engagements." She raised one hand. Someone behind her spoke quietly into a radio. "For larger operations," Major Voss said, "we use something else." The ground trembled. Not violently. Not the way a world shakes before annihilation. Just a low, steady vibration that climbed through the soles of Thalin's feet and settled somewhere deep in his second lung. At first, he thought it was a seismic anomaly. Then he realized the vibration was not coming from beneath the lunar surface. It was coming from within it. Something was moving up through the regolith. Something large. A platform rose from beneath the lunar surface, which meant the humans had been constructing something under the exhibition floor before the delegation had even arrived. The Vorthan survey teams had scanned that ground. They had certified it as empty. Either the humans had buried their equipment so deep that standard sensors missed it, or they had built it after the survey teams finished their work. Both possibilities were alarming. The first suggested technology the Vorthan did not possess. The second suggested a speed of construction that defied military logic. The platform was a long, flat structure, roughly 50 units in length, mounted on a reinforced base that seemed to absorb the lunar vibrations rather than transmit them. At its center ran a single barrel, thick as a transit tunnel, angled toward the target range. The barrel was not decorative. It was not ceremonial. It was functional in a way that made Thalin's threat assessment protocols activate for the first time in over a decade. "This," said Major Voss, "is a rail accelerator." Thalin knew what a rail accelerator was. Technically, every spacefaring species had experimented with electromagnetic projectile launch systems during their early industrial phase. Most abandoned the concept once directed energy weapons became practical. It was a transitional technology, a historical curiosity. The Vorthan themselves had shelved rail accelerator research over 800 years ago, considering it a dead end compared to plasma and particle beam systems. "You are aware," Thalin said very carefully, "that our alloy barriers are rated to withstand." The rail accelerator fired. The sound arrived before the light. That was already impossible. Sound traveled at roughly 340 units per second in lunar conditions. Light traveled at nearly 300 million. For the sound to arrive first, the projectile would have had to be moving at velocities that distorted local physics. Thalin's auditory sensors registered a concussive crack They felt less like a noise and more like a physical blow to his chest. Then the light arrived. It was not the light of an energy weapon discharge. It was the light of atmospheric ionization, a brief plasma trail left behind by something moving so fast that it was literally tearing molecules apart. Thalen's neural processor struggled to parse the sequence. Sound, then light, then the target barrier simply ceased to exist in the configuration it had previously occupied. It did not melt. It did not crack. It was removed. One moment, a solid block of Vorthen-grade alloy, rated for Class V impact resistance, stood at the far end of the range. The next moment, there was a dust cloud, a crater, and a tunnel bored through the reinforced retaining wall behind it. The projectile had struck the barrier, passed through it as if it were smoke, struck the wall, passed through that as well, and then buried itself in the impact-rated mound of lunar aggregate that Vorthen survey teams had constructed specifically for energy weapon dispersal. The mound was designed to stop plasma bolts. It was not designed to stop a solid projectile moving at a significant fraction of orbital velocity. The delegation was silent. Thalen stared at the column of displaced dust rising above where the target had been. He looked at Yevon. Yevon was staring at his sensor pad. Yevon's chromatophores had shifted, an involuntary response among Vorthens to elevated threat assessment. His skin was doing a color equivalent of screaming. Reload interval? Thalen asked. After a long moment, Yevon queried his pad. The pad answered. Yevon's coloration worsened. 4.7 seconds, Yevon said. His voice was steady, but Thalen had known him for 20 years and could hear the strain beneath the professionalism. The platform can sustain that rate for approximately 40 cycles before barrel degradation requires replacement. Thalen did the math. 4.7 seconds between shots, 40 cycles before maintenance. Each shot carrying enough force to reclassify as a minor seismic event. And this was just the version they were demonstrating, the version they were willing to show. Major Voss stepped up beside Thalen. She looked at the impact site the way someone looks at a thing they have seen many times before and find thoroughly unremarkable. "We have 16 of those in this hemisphere alone," she said pleasantly. "Another 22 deployed at various orbital stations. Those are optimized for long-range velocity engagement. The round you just watched travel over 7,000 units downrange arrived in 6 milliseconds. Thalen performed some quiet arithmetic, then some louder arithmetic. 16 platforms in one hemisphere, 22 orbital stations, each capable of delivering a kinetic impact that no Vorthen hull plating was rated to absorb. Energy weapons could be dissipated, deflected, absorbed. Kinetic impactors at these velocities could not. They arrived, and they kept arriving. Through the first layer, through the second, through anything else in the path. "Major," Thalen said, his voice remarkably steady, "may I ask what the projectile is composed of?" "Depends on the application," she said. "Standard kinetic rounds are dense metallic alloy. High-yield variants carry additional payload materials. There are fragmentation versions, incendiary versions, and several specialized configurations we are not required to demonstrate under exhibition protocol." "Specialized configurations?" She smiled at him. A small smile, polite, professional. "Commander," she said, "I think you understand why we wouldn't demonstrate those here." Thalen looked at the distant figure of Major Voss, who was now drinking something hot from a small insulated vessel and speaking calmly into her communication device. He had laughed 40 minutes ago on this same lunar surface. He had laughed at chemical combustion and metal impactors. The entire delegation had laughed with him, and it had echoed, and the human major had written something on her notepad and underlined it. He was beginning to understand what she had underlined. Thalen requested a recess. Major Voss granted it without hesitation. She did not ask how long he needed. She did not press for an explanation. She simply nodded, returned to her notepad, and began writing again. That silence was more unnerving than any threat could have been. He walked 40 paces away from the delegation before turning to Yevon. In a voice so low, he hoped it wasn't carrying across the lunar surface. He said, "Full capability analysis on those weapons. Everything. Deep scans. I want to know how many operational platforms they have, their sustained fire rate, their projectile mass capacity. And I want to know it before we go back in there." Yevon was already running the analysis. His sensor pad was connected to the Irrefutable Logic's main computer, which was in turn pulling data from every Vorthan intelligence asset in the system. The information arrived in fragments, each one more disturbing than the last. First came the orbital platform data. The humans had not hidden their stations. They had simply placed them in orbits that Vorthan survey protocols had classified as civilian. Communication relays, weather monitoring, navigation satellites. Except the sensor profiles didn't quite match standard civilian configurations. The power signatures were too high. The thermal emissions were too structured. When Yevon's analysis software stripped away the signal masking, what remained was unmistakable. 22 kinetic launch platforms, each one capable of engaging targets anywhere on the planet's surface or in low orbit. Then came the ground platform data. 16 rail accelerators in one hemisphere, but that was just a confirmed count. The analysis suggested at least 12 more in the other hemisphere, plus another 8 in various oceanic installations that the Vorthan had completely missed because they had assumed humans couldn't build underwater. And then came the data that made Thalin's secondary lung stop functioning for a full 3 seconds. "Commander," Yevon said, "these numbers are from one nation-state." Thalin stared at him. "What do you mean, one nation-state?" "Earth has approximately 195 recognized sovereign states. Major Voss represents one of them. The rail accelerator technology appears to be deployed by at least 16 others, with varying specifications." Thalin processed this. One nation-state had built at least 48 rail accelerator platforms. 16 other nation-states had built their own versions. The specifications varied. Some were less powerful. Some were more. Some were designed for anti-ship engagement. Some were designed for orbital defense. Some were designed for purposes that the Vorthan intelligence database had no classification for. "Pull the survey data on their orbital installations," Thalin said very quietly. "All of them?" Yevon pulled the data. Thalin looked at it for a very long time. The humans had not just built weapons. They had built an entire ecosystem of weapons, kinetic systems, energy systems, electronic warfare systems, biological detection systems. They had built redundant networks that could survive the loss of half their infrastructure and still function. They had built fail-safes and backup fail-safes and backup fail-safes for the backup fail-safes. They had built like a species that expected to lose everything and keep fighting anyway. "Cancel the afternoon session," Thalin said. "I need to contact the Imperial Council." The Council did not take the call well. Thalin stood in the narrow communications bay of the Irrefutable Logic and watched 3 senior officials cycle through the same emotional stages he had experienced on the lunar surface, just in a smaller room with worse lighting. First, disbelief. Then the specific silence that follows disbelief when the data is sitting right there, refusing to change. Then a great deal of rapid, unproductive talking. High Arbiter Kale, the most senior of the 3, finally said, "You are telling me that a pre-warp species has orbital kinetic platforms capable of penetrating vessel hulls at engagement ranges where our plasma destabilizers require a full charge?" "I am telling you that, yes." "And they laughed at you?" "For laughing at them?" Thalin paused. "No, they didn't laugh. That's the part I keep thinking about. Explain." "When we laughed at their conventional weapons, the Major didn't react. She took notes. She waited. Then she showed us the rail accelerator platforms. There was no satisfaction in it. No performance. She showed us the way you show someone a door that was always going to be there. She wasn't trying to impress us, Arbiter. She was completing a procedure. The second official, Delegate Soroth, made a dismissive gesture. Procedure or not, these are rail-accelerated projectiles. Kinetic impact technology. We have hull plating rated to absorb. Our hull plating is rated to absorb plasma fire and directed energy at standard engagement ranges, Yevon said from behind Thalen. He had entered without being invited. A kinetic impactor traveling at the velocity recorded from that demonstration carries an entirely different category of force. It doesn't burn through. It doesn't disperse. It arrives, and it keeps arriving. Through the first layer. Through the second. Through anything else in its path. Soroth went quiet. Yevon brought up the numbers on the secondary screen so the council officials could see them. The room got quieter. How long had they had this technology? Kale asked. Thalen checked his notes from Major Voss's pre-submission briefing. Experimental versions for approximately 65 of their years. Operational military deployment for roughly 20. Civilian academic research on electromagnetic rail acceleration predates that by another 35 years. 65 years, Kale repeated. 65 years of developing a technology we classified as transitional and abandoned. We abandoned it because energy weapons became viable, Thalen said. The humans didn't abandon it. They made it faster, more accurate, smaller, which is somehow the most alarming part. He turned to Yevon. Show them the portable unit. Yevon brought it up. A handheld electromagnetic rail accelerator, roughly the length of a human forearm. Single operator. The muzzle velocity was lower than the platform weapon, obviously, but it was still a number that had no business existing in something carried by one person. The energy density alone should have required a backpack power source. The heat dissipation should have melted the operator's hand. And yet the humans had apparently solved both problems well enough to field the weapon in extended trials. Kale stared at the specifications. That is a personal weapon. That is a personal weapon, Thalen confirmed. And that is also from one nation-state. The third official, who had not spoken since the call began, said quietly, "What are they asking for?" Everyone looked at him. His name was Veth. He oversaw strategic acquisitions, which meant he had a different kind of mind than the diplomats. He was already past the surprise, already running the next set of calculations. "I haven't returned to discuss terms yet," Thalen said. "I requested this consultation first." "Return to them," Veth said, "but not with the hegemony accords. Take the standard non-interference compact instead. Mutual sovereignty recognition. Trade access. No integration clauses." He looked at the numbers on the secondary screen again. "We don't want those weapons pointed at us. And we don't want those weapons pointed anywhere near us while someone else makes them angry." Kale turned sharply. "You are recommending we offer them the non-interference compact? Terms we haven't offered anyone in the last 14 absorptions?" "I am recommending," Veth said, "that we walk in there and not make them angry." Thalen closed the Kung channel shortly afterward. He stood in the narrow bay for a moment by himself, listening to the ambient hum of the ship. 32 years. 51 species. The arithmetic, as he had always said, solved itself. The arithmetic had solved itself again, just not in the direction he was accustomed to. He walked back to the lunar surface shuttle bay, collected Commander Yevon, and sent a message ahead to Major Voss's liaison requesting the afternoon session resume at her convenience. The reply came in 6 minutes. The Major would meet them at the Summit Hall in 1 hour. She was already there when they arrived. She was eating something from a flat container, reading from her notepad, and had apparently used the recess to bring in 2 additional staff members who were arranging documents along the far side of the table. She looked up when Thalen entered, set down both the food and the notepad, and said, "Commander, welcome back." Thalen took his seat. Yevon sat to his left. 2 diplomatic aides filled the chairs behind him. "Major," Thalen said, I would like to discuss a different framework for today's conversation. She folded her hands on the table, said nothing, waited. He had spent 32 years sitting across from representatives of 51 species. Most of them filled silence with noise, explanations, reassurances, anxious words. Silence made most beings uncomfortable. Major Voss sat in silence the way a stone sits in a river, completely at rest, not performing patience, simply having it. The Hegemony Accords, Thalen said, which my government presented as the proposed framework for these discussions, have a specific structure built around integrating smaller polities into the Vorthan system. Given what we have learned today about Earth's capabilities, my government believes a different framework may be more suitable. He slid a document across the table. This is a non-interference compact. Mutual recognition of sovereignty. Defined borders. Trade access on agreed terms. No integration provisions. Major Voss picked up the document. She read it. She was a fast reader. Her eyes moved across the pages with a speed that suggested she was not just reading, but memorizing, cross-referencing, comparing against templates stored in her own mental database. When she finished, she set it down and said, "This is the first time you've offered these terms to anyone." It wasn't a question. She already knew the answer. Thalen suspected she had known the answer before walking into the room that morning. "It is," he said. "May I ask what changed your assessment?" It was a reasonable question. It was also, Thalen was fairly certain, a question she already knew the answer to. "Your demonstration was thorough," he said. The corner of her mouth moved just slightly. "The rail accelerators. Among other things." She looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up her stylus and opened a fresh page on her notepad. "Commander, I want to be direct with you about something, because I think it will save both of our governments time in the long run." She set the stylus flat across the notepad. "We were aware of the Vorthan integration process before you arrived. We knew what you had offered the other 51 species. We knew your weapons capability. We knew the standard exhibition structure." Thalen's second lung, which had been settling after the morning, tightened again. "How?" "We've been in contact with several of the species you previously integrated," she said, informally. "The Kithril sent us technical documentation on Vorthan plasma destabilizers 22 months ago. The volume transmit summit protocols. The Sudran, who are deeply unhappy with their integration terms, were particularly generous with information." Thalen stared at her. The Sudran were supposed to be fully integrated. Their communication networks were supposed to be monitored. Their diplomatic channels were supposed to be restricted. If the Sudran had passed information to humanity, it meant the Vorthan intelligence apparatus had failed completely. "We prepared accordingly," she said. "The rail accelerator platforms at the exhibition site have been operational for 6 years. The orbital installations have been active for 4. The handheld accelerators are newer, still in extended field trials. But we brought one today because the specifications are complete and the data is accurate." She picked up the stylus again. "We didn't build these things because you were coming. We built them because we are the kind of species that builds things." He believed that. He believed it completely. And that was the part that unsettled him most, not the weapons. The weapons were measurable, analyzable. What unsettled him was the recognition that the weapons were not a response to the Vorthan. They were simply what humans had been doing on their own, for themselves, while orbiting their ordinary star on their unremarkable planet with their single heart and their thin skin and their complete absence of caution about the kind of universe they were building toward. Thalen thought about the 51 species he had integrated. Most of them had accepted Vorthan terms because the arithmetic was undeniable. Their weapons were inferior. Their economies were smaller. Their populations were smaller. The math solved itself. But the humans had looked at the same math and reached a different conclusion. They had looked at their inferior weapons and decided to build better ones. They had looked at their smaller economy and decided to out-innovate. They had looked at their fragile biology and decided that the best defense was to make the cost of attacking them absolutely ruinous. There are a few modifications we would want to discuss on your compact document, Voss said, pulling him back. She uncapped the stylus. Trade access framing, primarily. And we would want to add a mutual defense consultation clause, which is standard in our bilateral agreements. Nothing aggressive. Just a communication requirement if either party is approached by a third power. Fallon nodded slowly. That is manageable. Good. She began marking up the document. One more thing. She looked up at him. The 14 species currently under integration terms who assisted us, they will want improved terms. We would consider supporting the new compact framework if Vorthen agrees to open renegotiation with those species within one standard galactic year. That's not a demand. It's a strong preference. Fallon thought about Veth back on the council call. We don't want those weapons pointed at us. He thought about the orbital platforms, the 22 additional positions. The one nation state out of 195. I think, Fallon said, that can be arranged. She nodded and went back to marking up the document, professionally, efficiently, in the same tone she had used all day, from the first clasp in the docking bay to the moment he had laughed and she had written something and underlined it. Fallon sat across from her and watched her work. He did not reach for the notepad because he already knew what she had underlined. He had laughed at metal pieces propelled by burning chemicals. She had written, "They haven't asked about the rail accelerators yet." The session continued for another 2 hours. Fallon found himself studying Major Voss the way he might study a tactical problem. She was not trying to intimidate him. She was not gloating. She was not even particularly interested in his discomfort. She was simply executing a plan that had been in motion long before his fleet ever entered the system. Every question he asked, she answered. Every concern he raised, she addressed. She had data for everything. Not just military data, economic data, demographic data, infrastructure data. She knew how many rail accelerators each nation-state possessed. She knew which nations had shared technology and which had kept their development secret. She knew the political dynamics that would govern human decision-making in the event of a conflict. At one point, Fallon asked about human unity. Your species is divided into nearly 200 sovereign states, he said. How can you guarantee that any agreement we sign will be honored by all of them? Major Voss set down her stylus. We can't, she said. That's the honest answer. No human government can speak for all humans. But we can tell you something about how humans work. She leaned forward slightly. When an external threat emerges, humans have a consistent pattern. At first, we argue. We disagree about the nature of the threat, the appropriate response, the allocation of resources. This phase can last for years. Sometimes decades. Fallon waited. But eventually, she continued, a threshold is crossed. The threat becomes undeniable. And when that happens, humans don't unify because we agree with each other. We unify because the cost of not unifying becomes higher than the cost of setting aside our differences. The Vorthen Empire, Commander, has not yet crossed that threshold for us. But if you were to push harder, if you were to escalate, you would discover something interesting. What would we discover? That every single one of those 195 nation-states has its own version of the weapons we showed you today. Some are better than ours. Some are worse. But all of them exist, and all of them are pointed outward. She picked up her stylus again. We don't agree on much, Commander. But we agree on this. Nobody tells us what to do. Fallon absorbed this. He thought about the Vorthen intelligence reports that had described humans as fractious, disorganized, incapable of sustained collective action. Those reports were not wrong. Humans were fractious. They were disorganized. They argued constantly. But the reports had missed something essential. The humans had built weapons capable of threatening a Vorthen fleet, not because they were united, but because they were paranoid. Each nation-state had developed its own defenses, because it trusted no one else to defend it. The result was redundancy on a scale the Vorthen had never encountered. The session concluded 3 hours later with initialed pages and a scheduled follow-up for full ratification. The document was not perfect from a Vorthen perspective. It granted the humans more autonomy than any other species had received. It required the Vorthen to renegotiate terms with 14 previously integrated species. It established a mutual defense consultation clause that would give humans a voice in Vorthen military decisions. But it also ensured that the rail accelerators would not be fired in anger. And that, Fallon had come to understand, was the only outcome that mattered. As the delegation prepared to leave, Major Voss stood and extended her hand. Fallon clasped it with his primary manipulator. Her grip was firm. Her expression was neutral. She looked like someone who had just completed a routine paperwork submission. "Commander," she said, "I want to thank you for your professionalism today. This process was productive." Fallon searched for sarcasm in her voice. He found none. She genuinely seemed to view the day's events as a successful negotiation between equals. Not a humiliation, not a defeat, just business. "Major," he said, "may I ask you something personal?" "You can ask." "When we laughed at your conventional weapons, what did you write down?" She smiled. It was the first genuine smile he had seen from her all day. "I wrote, 'They haven't asked about the rail accelerators yet,' and then I underlined it." "Why?" "Because I knew you would," she said. "Sooner or later, every commander asks the same question. What else do you have? And when you ask that question, you've already lost. Because you're no longer comparing capabilities. You're hoping there isn't more." She tucked her notepad under her arm. "Safe travels, Commander?" Fallon watched her walk back toward her staff. She moved with the same unhurried confidence she had shown that morning. Nothing had changed for her. She had come to the exhibition expecting a specific outcome, and she had achieved it. The fact that the outcome had fundamentally altered the Vorthen Empire's understanding of power in this sector of the galaxy seemed not to concern her at all. The Vorthen delegation returned to the irrefutable logic before the lunar surface had finished cooling where the demonstration round had struck. The ship lifted from its landing pad with a smoothness that belied the chaos of the day. Within 20 minutes, they were in low orbit. Within an hour, they were burning for the edge of the system. Yevon stood at the main viewport, watching the planet recede below them, blue and green and white. One moon, one ordinary star, 195 countries, each one armed with weapons that should not exist, built by a species that should not have been able to build them. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Yevon said. Fallon stood beside him at the viewport. "Tell me." She said they built those platforms for themselves. "Not for us." "Yes." "Which means," Yevon said, "when they pointed them at our demonstration targets today, they were showing us the minimum." Fallon said nothing, because there was nothing to add. Yevon was right. The humans had not deployed their full arsenal. They had deployed a fraction of it. Enough to make a point. Enough to change the arithmetic, but not enough to reveal their true capabilities. Those remained hidden, distributed across 195 sovereign states, each one guarding its own secrets. The planet grew smaller in the viewport, and then smaller still. Fallon watched until Earth became a pale blue dot, indistinguishable from 1,000 other pale blue dots scattered across the galaxy. But he knew he would never look at those dots the same way again, because now he knew what could be hiding beneath the surface, what could be waiting in orbit, what could be built by a species that refused to accept the arithmetic that had governed the galaxy for millennia. "Commander," Yevon said, "the Council is requesting an after-action report. What should I tell them?" Fallon considered the question. He thought about the laughter on the lunar surface, the sound that had echoed across the regolith that he would hear in his memory for the rest of his career. He thought about Major Voss writing in her notepad, underlining a sentence he had not been meant to see until it was too late. He thought about the rail accelerator firing, the target barrier ceasing to exist, the realization that the arithmetic had solved itself in the wrong direction. Tell them, Thalen said slowly, that we encountered a species which does not understand the concept of obsolescence. Tell them that the humans took a technology every other civilization abandoned and refined it for centuries. Tell them that they have distributed their weapons across nearly 200 independent states, each one capable of acting independently, each one prepared to defend itself. He paused. And tell them, he continued, that the major representing that species spent the entire day taking notes. Not because she was impressed, not because she was intimidated, but because she was collecting data for the next time. There will be a next time, Yevon. Not with us. We signed the compact. But someone else will come. Someone else will laugh at their chemical propellants and their metal fragments. And when that happens, the humans will be ready. They are always ready. The irrefutable logic moved away into the deep dark between stars, carrying 32 years of experience, a signed non-interference compact, and something else. Something that didn't have a direct translation in the Vorthan language, but might be described as the specific feeling of realizing you were the punchline to a joke you didn't know was being told. Thalen did not laugh on the way home. He had learned today what that looked like from the other side of the table. It looked like a major with a stylus and a flat notepad, writing something down and waiting. Yevon returned to his station. The crew went about their duties. The ship hummed with the quiet energy of a vessel that had completed its mission and was heading for safe harbor. But Thalen remained at the viewport, watching the stars slide past, thinking about a species that had looked at the vast, terrifying universe and decided that the only reasonable response was to build a bigger hammer. He thought about the handheld rail accelerator, small enough to fit in a human palm. He thought about the 16 platforms in one hemisphere. He thought about the 22 orbital stations. He thought about the 195 nation-states, each one pursuing its own weapons programs, each one convinced that its neighbors were not doing enough. And he thought about what would happen if those 195 nation-states ever truly unified, not out of fear, not out of coercion, but out of genuine collective purpose. The Vorthan Empire had dominated this sector for centuries by being the biggest power in the room. But Thalen had just learned a valuable lesson. Being the biggest power only worked until you encountered a species that didn't care about the room. A species that was willing to burn down the entire building rather than be told where to sit. The pale blue dot vanished from the viewport. The irrefutable logic continued on its course. And Commander Thalen Vorsk, who had overseen 14 planetary absorptions and certified the disarmament of 51 species, began to write his after-action report. He started with the words that would define the rest of his career. We made them laugh. And then they showed us why we shouldn't have. If you made it this far, hit like and subscribe to Winds of Thought for more stories where humanity refuses to read the room and builds a bigger hammer instead.